to go? Okay. So I'll show what the talk will be like. So I'm very diagram focused, and I think it will be maybe less of a linear, more like I'll mention ideas that the current work that I've been making gave me, and also some of the thinking about infrastructure from recent time and what I've been reading. So ideally, some of these are kind of seeds if people are interested in looking more at that, or if we have time, hopefully, to talk about stuff. This is a diagram of kind of my context. I've been thinking also like, yeah, placing myself and what I do, and also because of relationship to infrastructure. So like where my practice comes from, and also my ability to make things. Like it's kind of non-trivial that I make what I make now. So, you know, here I am as a workshop technician. So I work in the university that I study as an electronics technician, which means I have access to an infrastructure that students don't, essentially. And that's, again, like a non-trivial thing for making. Especially because a lot of my thoughts are about infrastructure and systems. So to be embedded in it and then to kind of navigate questions of like employment and accessibility of tools, learning tools or machining tools, making tools, components. So from this, I think, like something to mention is that I think this has kind of severely shaped like my interest in structures, whether educational or economic. I was doing private tutoring for a while, for like 4 years for physics and math, and it was mostly to kids of very rich parents, and that was like an interesting exposure also to like possibilities and what educational infrastructure affords and doesn't. Especially when like the idea of tutoring for those kids is a kind of very direct aim to get to a particular place, and their parents' capital enables that. And then to be a participant in that is a kind of grinding thing after a while. And then I was working as a freelance illustrator, and I started on Fiverr. I don't know if you know the Fiverr platform, but it's a hellscape, essentially. It's a hellscape to work there, and then you get shit for having worked there from other illustrators because it's so looked down upon. So I think that's also kind of like started to shape my thinking about infrastructure. And then, like what I mentioned, workshop technician. And then I have some examples of other work that I do, but if we have time, and I will move on to the piece that I'm presenting here. So it's WEBPIT, and there were 2 previous iterations of the work, so it's a kind of ongoing work. It started off as this like server-based kind of participative performance. So I made the server, Node.js server with WebSockets, and I opened it at a particular time, and people knew the time, and they all joined the server from different places. And then the idea was that when you join the server, you essentially appear as this, like just a word. So you're either you and everybody else is other, and that's the only thing you see. But if you move close to someone else, like within the server space, you get connected with a line. So it's a kind of visualization of self-organization. And then we did it for an hour, and I filmed the structures that people come up with, and also like types appear. I mean, there are people that just want to cause destruction and like are committed to kind of causing destruction for 30 minutes in terms of like doing this. And then there are people that are, essentially make kind of these abstract friendships, right? Like there were some that were circling for a while around each other and, in their connection, or making little groups. And that happened with the simplest, kind of visualization ever, which is just lines connecting people on a server. Then the second one was a server like on a Raspberry Pi, and it had this like solar charging station. So the idea that it would be like a portable device. And then it creates a local network. There's no internet access. You join the local Wi-Fi network, and then you get a word out of there. So there's like a large selection of words. You get an assigned word, and you make concrete poetry basically with other people, because you see the other words moving about and you kind of move them together or apart. So it had the component from the previous work, which is like proximity meaning, like you move them together, they make meaning, you move them apart, they stop. But in this case, yeah, like the words, of course, they had, they kind of shaped it. So this is one of the examples from like the poems that people made, like pleasurable against lie, birthday meanness. I like birthday meanness. Yeah. And then the current iteration, which like essentially I kind of wanted to think more about. Well, one is like energy that enables something like this to happen, and energy infrastructure, but also trying to like, yeah, I just had this sense of like, I need to try to understand the electronics and like how they participate in this. It's a kind of denied thing. And working with a Raspberry Pi, like, yeah, I had the sense of this is it's an incredibly like powerful and also deeply developed multi-layered tool on which I sit at the very top layer, making something happen. So I kind of wanted to try and dig down. So in this case, you have a generator cranking, you use a motor. So essentially any motor can be a generator, which is also an interesting kind of like flipping our systems, right? Motors eat energy to can produce mechanical work. You can drive them the other way. It charges up. There's a circuit. There's a supercapacitor that holds the charge, and then there's a microcontroller that pulls from the supercapacitor. It wakes up. It creates a network, like a Wi-Fi network. If you join the network and you go to the IP address, there's a poem that's looping, but you can only, like, it only loops if somebody's cranking. So essentially, even if you get and then somebody stops, you're stuck at the first line of the poem. And then, so now I'll kind of machine gun through the diagrams. So I think very important thing for me and like shaping my thinking is, notion of labor, within the economy or otherwise. So like, even just to begin the distinction between labor and work, like in basic mechanics, we talk about work as essentially like a displacement in the direction of a force. So it's interesting because circular motion actually does not accomplish work in mechanics. So you can go in circles as long as you want. There's no work being done. And then labor has a completely different connotation, and there's a kind of valorization of like, there's labor of love, but then there's work of art. There's no labor of art, as an expression. And this idea of like which one of them means effort or toil, and which one of them is kind of embedded in capital infrastructure. Like when somebody says they're a laborer, that has a very particular kind of value judgment within the system, versus worker, which is like we're all workers, right? One super important thing was the idea of a gimmick, which is this thinker Sian Ngai and the book Theory of the Gimmick. Like the claim is basically that the gimmick is a very particular capitalist aesthetic judgment. Like when people use it all the time, like people call something bullshit or a gimmick all the time. You don't have to belong to a kind of aesthetic world to do that. But we mean a very particular thing, which is that there's a relationship between time, labor, and value, and it's incorrect, which is why it's a gimmick. Like it's either there's not enough labor for the value claim, like you haven't worked hard enough, or like it doesn't show the labor, but it makes a value claim, so it's a gimmick, like there's a fakery there. But it's also the other way around, when something tries too hard for the value claim, like when something is basically a replica of something else, right? Like it tries really hard to replicate something else, but it doesn't have it in it to be the thing, so that's also a gimmick. And it got me to this, to thinking about like working as an aesthetic category, like when you make electronic artworks or media pieces, it's not trivial to ask whether it's working or not. And I think there's something different when you ask whether it's working. And like, it's not only a question like, does it function? Like, it's not a binary, because there's actually an internal system that like, you know, offers a range of possibilities. Like, does it involve labor of someone else? Does it pull from the grid? Like, what does it mean for an artwork to be working, right? And then a lot of new media artworks are like, and you know, I've made them, and I think we all make them. They're kind of leaching in terms of energy. Like, they work on their own, but they run off the grid, which means they're working in a kind of like, we set them up, right? They're a constant labor that we left. And then that, yeah, brings the idea of like smoke and mirrors, which is, I found out that it's not so common of an expression as I thought. I think in the UK it was very common, which is something that you do when basically the artwork doesn't work, but you set it up as if it does. So you call it smoke and mirror. So it's like it's a fake working. Yeah, and I was thinking, like, I was encouraged to make things like that as a like point of last resort. And I was like, that's a really strange place we got to. That's how we want to like think about it. That smoke and mirrors, and then of course he had like the idea of a black box. Then networks. I mean, there's a lot to talk about networks. I think the thing that attracts me and that I've been like thinking mostly about is the setting up of a network as a kind of a making of place within an existing space. Like, if a microcontroller establishes a network, essentially you're kind of suspending a new space. But then our metaphors surrounding networks are very celestial, like telegraph lines were suspended above our heads, right? And the net kind of envelops the globe hanging above us. Yeah, and the internet is like, or you know, well, you also have like radio waves. It's all kind of air-based metaphors. And I think the reason why I think of like the WEBPIT is partly because of energy use, like the problematic energy, right? Like within our infrastructure comes from down. There's nothing kind of, you know, celestial or suspended about it. We dig holes all the time, like we make energy holes in everything we do, right? To set any structure up, you need to dig a hole somewhere else, essentially. So just kind of flipping, like, or thinking about this flip. The Emmanuel Kocha has an interesting idea about like we're suspended in the air all the time. Like, our bodies are 90% in the air, only our feet are touching the ground. So essentially we're celestial, like we're all antennas, really. And then our relationship with the earth is pretty much extractivist. And then the mosh pit, like I used to be a metalhead, very much so, and I still go. The mosh pit is like, basically it's a liminal space that would be made within, you know, like the space of the concert. So it's, again, it's like a network. It's a space within a space, then it gets its own communication rules. Like in the mosh pit, you behave very differently to how you behave outside of the mosh pit. And the way you set it up, it's like, there's no, like, nobody talks. You just look at people and then they set up a mosh pit. And the communication, like, network changes. Okay. About energy, I've been reading this book called like Electrifying Anthropology, which is about anthropology of electricity. And it's, yeah, it like transformed a lot of my thoughts, actually. It's a selection of essays. But I think one of the main, like the thing that they're driving at all the time is that our early understanding of electricity has shaped our electricity infrastructure, but that understanding, like a lot of it was essentially like fictional. Like we had ideas about electricity that did not turn out to be true. For example, like there's the like Edison, his thinking, and there's a lot of shit to say about Edison and his kind of aggressive models, but his thinking was about electricity like other energy sources, like gas, which meant that his early business model was that you sell individual generators to people or like companies, and then they use a generator, right? But the energy grid, basically, in order to set up the energy grid, you have to think of electricity as a temporal question, essentially. It's not about transfer of gas like other, or transfer of other materials. It's a question of like, when is the grid available? It's not like you take an object and you place it somewhere else. And electricity doesn't work like that. It's an instantaneous connection. So you have to be connected, and then it's instantaneous, and you're always on it. And that kind of like that transformed thinking essentially was needed for the grid. Then in relation to kind of devices leeching off, I was thinking a lot about the grid as being a sublime project, or like a sublime object, like a capitalist sublime, where the sockets in your walls are limitless. Like they're not actually, but the way we approach them is that anything you plug in is going to draw as much as it needs and like come alive and do the thing that you want to do. So there's a kind of, all of our walls are filled with this sublime resource. And a lot of the artworks that we make also kind of run on that. You know that there's a guaranteed energy source, and you'll take as much as you need for it to run. And only sometimes you deal with, like, if you have an extension cord, like if you daisy chain 5 times and then plug in a washing machine, that might be a problem. There are other devices drawing current, but most of the time you're really dealing with it as a kind of, endlessness. So yeah, supply versus draw, and then this idea of like leeching devices that are suspended in the grid. Some thoughts about, so I make, custom electronics. The board that I made here turned out to be extremely simple. It was a more complex board, and then it got simplified because I realized as I was, and this is the final one, as I was testing and making it, it was like a continuing realization that if you don't have a constant energy source, or even like a constant initial reference point for the current you're generating or the voltage you're generating, a lot of things change. Like you don't have an endlessness to pull from. The original device that I made was just not generating enough current, and I spent ages like trying to kind of negotiate that in a variety of ways, and then realized that none of that works because the source is non-negotiable. Like it just doesn't have enough. And I think that there's something about like thinking about scarcity of resource that is extremely important. I mean, always has been, but as a kind of like almost self-imposed, like that we should try to get out of kind of thinking of abundance, because that abundance is built on, it's actually built on scarcity. It's just that on our end, that scarcity is not so evident. There's this, like Harun Mirza, an artist, has this quote of like, my medium is electricity. I really like the artist. I remember hearing it and being like, wow, that's a really, like you need a lot of conviction to say that, because I think for a lot of us, it's like, that's a huge claim to make. Your medium is like Arduino, your medium is code. Like to get to the point where you'll be able to say that your medium is electricity, I think it takes much more than maybe like, than we assume, or like I wouldn't say that. I'm kind of trying to think about electricity, and been thinking about it for a while, but I think it's like, is it a gimmick? Like, is this claim a gimmick? And then maybe to like finish on final thoughts about infrastructure that I'm in, to kind of like, again, position myself. So I work in Design Factory, and this is very quickly, this is a definition of what Design Factory is. It has like keywords that, make me stay up at night. It's like innovation hubs, like mission to create change in the world of teaching and learning, passion-based culture, effective problem solving. Like I like in my working life, I spend most of my time with engineering students. Even I'm from the arts. I help them make electronics essentially. So I deal a lot with problem-based thinking, and it's a crazy world in terms of how resources are used and how they think about resources. But also, I think it's important, like the things that I make are always exposed to engineers, which is, I get a lot of shit for anything I make just because it's engineers looking at it. Like the crank generator, like they will make comments all the time about whether it's whether it's well designed for example, industry, like how, it doesn't this water jet cut thing has no claim towards industry, but at the same time, it's a kind of exposure to a frame of thinking, essentially, that I am not in. But I think that's very important to like face that. And then maybe a final thought about I am like on this kind of ongoing journey to drop commercial use of commercial software altogether, or like proprietary. So like you can see at the bottom of my desktop, it's a bunch of, like maybe some of you know, but yeah, these are like essentially all open source alternatives, kind of to Adobe, because I was educated in Adobe and like all of the programs, and then transitioning from that has been like, there's a lot to talk about, but one of the turning points was it was not actually Adobe, it was I'm now blanking on it, but like it was one of the kind of like infrastructure or group of programs that oh yeah, it was Autodesk. I was trying to get rid of Autodesk on my laptop, and Adobe at least has a semi-transparent cleanup in terms of getting rid of any trace of it on your machine, outside of license tracking software, which is software that essentially keeps track whether you have pirated Adobe, and that stays. They just kind of keep it there, right? It's like it's a long-term commitment to not have pirated Adobe. But then with Autodesk, when uninstalling, and there was some manual uninstallation that I had to do, which was already frustrating. And then, like one of the final stages, I was uninstalling one of these like weird last things, and when uninstalling, like a pop-up window comes up that covers up the window of like finishing the like uninstalling Autodesk. And then I was like looking at people were talking, yeah, like this is what happens. This is what happens to all of us. They literally have a pop-up window that prevents you from uninstalling the tracking software for like legitimate copies of Autodesk software. Like this is beyond fucked up. Like I can't even get rid of this anymore. And yeah, it's a kind of idealist, right? Like to try and source. It's been hard. Like open source CAD software is if people use FreeCAD, is janky as hell. That's what I use to like make my machine, and what they make for like and KiCad for all models. But then another point is like you make it all, and then you go to the machine, which I have available because of where I work. It's an industry machine. And then there's no way to negotiate with the fact that the only software that's going to drive the water jet cutter is the software of the company that made the water jet cutter. There's no hacking, and it's like it's a blank kind of like there's no interface, right? And so I'll just, you know, I'm entirely dependent on it. So like how far I'm able to transition is a kind of ongoing question. Yeah, I don't know, but when I started, I'll just say like just quickly what the other works are. So I have a thing with my friend called Spark Sound Kitchen. We cook together, like we hook up sensors and microphones around the kitchen. Like we come into the kitchen, we hook it up, and then we make a sound performance, and people cook. And the idea is that it does not interfere with the cooking. Like there's nothing that kind of makes it more performative. Like you should be able to do all the things that you're able to do when cooking. Yeah, we did a couple of them, and other people are involved. So other people come and cook. It's like a community, and we usually dumpster dive for food. So the food that we use is like saved from dumpsters as much as we can. These are some photos from like recent. So for example, like the knife has a like set up sensor board, and then it streams to a motherboard like over Wi-Fi that goes into a pure data patch and then modifies the sound picked up by Surface microphones. And this was us making nettle soup. And then another thing, which is like a long ongoing thing, is about. These are my aunt's notebooks. She has been documenting her life for like 20 years every day in these 38 categories. I made kind of a group of, and it's ongoing like group of works looking at time and autonomy over time and politics of labor. And recently I wrote a play about it, and we showed it at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. It's like a one-woman play. based on the notebooks and these daily habits. Yes, I'm done. Sorry. Yeah, I guess there's no time for questions, but hopefully we can talk later. And I'll leave now.